Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank our panelists. What a tremendous opportunity is for us to hear from you and interact with you. And Mr. Chairman, I really want to join the thanks of holding this hearing, also to the ranking member. As you said in the outset, and many have commented, this is a very big and very complex issue. And so I hope we'll have additional opportunities. And I want to say that I'm glad that you're recognizing this committee's role in that discussion, and I hope that we can keep that up. There's a number of things I wanted to touch on. I heard the ranking member talking about upholding the models in states that are working. And I usually love to brag about my state, but in this particular case, I am just going to share some of the statistics about racial disparities in the incarcerated population in our state. In Wisconsin, African Americans constitute only 6% of the state population, a little bit more. 35% of those incarcerated in state prisons are African American. According to a recent study from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, 13% of Wisconsin's African American men of working age were behind bars, which is almost double the national average of 6.7%. And the figures were particularly shocking and dismal for Milwaukee County, where more than 50% of African American men in their 30s had served time in prison. 45% of the inmates at our federal correctional facility, Oxford, are African American, and 19.3 are Hispanic. And I hope as we continue to work on this very complex issue that that will be on our minds. I also just wanted to mention it. I previously, people are talking about their previous service, attorney generals, et cetera. I was never attorney general. I practiced law in a small general practice firm at the very beginning of my career. Mostly general practice. A couple of times I took misdemeanor public defender cases. That's really my only immediate interaction. But I was becoming involved in county politics and state-level legislative office at this time where I felt like I saw the precursors of what we're seeing now being debated. So I had the honor, actually, of serving as chairwoman of the Corrections Committee in the state legislature for one term. I actually took our committee to prisons for tours, for visits, for conversations with people who worked there, people who were inmates there. We had sometimes legislative hearings in the prisons. We went to the intake facility, one of the maximum security prisons, one of the medium security prisons for men, one of the minimum security prisons for men. We went to the women's prison on a couple of occasions and visited work release facilities. At the same time, the legislature was talking about, should we allow private prisons to be built and run in Wisconsin? Should we contract with other states to deal with our overflow issues and have them house our Wisconsin prisoners? And the counties were doing the same thing because some of the jails at the county level were overflowing. And the debate, the substantive criminal justice debate in our state at the time, and this is the early 90s, 3 strikes, you're out, elimination of probation parole. We were creating new felonies. We had A felony and a B felony. We created an AB felony. New crimes were being created. And there was a lot of debate about the elimination of prison-based vocational programs. Mandatory minimums were a big topic. You could see all of this sort of in the future, and now the future has come, and it is not going to be overnight that we figure out what missteps we had and how we deal with this in a saner way. I have a couple of questions, and if I don't get to all of them, I'm hoping that you will be willing to submit some answers in writing for some things we might not get to. Quickly, Ms. Kerman, you mentioned that women are the fastest growing prison population right now. I remember years ago when I was visiting the women's prison in Wisconsin, it seemed that to me there were gender differences in how they dealt with certain issues. We've talked a lot about solitary confinement. Is there a gender difference in how these issues are dealt with in women's prisons? For example, I remember being very concerned about over-medication of women in the women's prison to deal with behavioral issues as opposed to placement in solitary confinement. Is this something we should still be looking at?
We should absolutely be looking at the use of solitary confinement in men's and women's prisons. I echo Udi's testimony that solitary confinement is often used not for the most serious infractions, like an assault, for example, but rather for very low-level infractions. Women are overwhelmingly likely to be incarcerated for a nonviolent crime and are very unlikely to use violence while they are incarcerated. Women's facilities do not tend to struggle with violence as one of their guiding issues in terms of security. Solitary confinement is overwhelmingly used as a punitive measure. Female prisoners are disproportionately likely to suffer from mental illness. Their mental illness in men's facilities is a huge problem. It's an even bigger problem in women's facilities. One of the tragic things about solitary confinement is that mentally ill people have a more difficult time following the rules of a prison. And so what you see is spiraling sanctions, which ultimately land them in solitary confinement, a place profoundly inappropriate for anybody with mental illness. A regularly healthy person who's placed in solitary confinement for 10 days, after 10 days will start to significantly deteriorate mentally, emotionally, psychologically, let alone a mentally ill person placed in those circumstances.
Since I only have a couple of seconds left, let me ask a quick question about reentry and both in prison and after prison access to vocational and educational programming. And you can certainly feel free to elaborate after the fact in writing, because I know I have such limited time. But again, I recall the restriction of any sort of public funds or individualized financial aid assistance to those, particularly in state prison, because that was something I was looking at closely. I believe that's continued over time, and we have additional restrictions once a person is back in the community. They want to seek additional vocational or higher education generally. It makes it impossible for the financial aid. You've talked already, Mr. Dillard, about people emerging burdened with debt not related to higher education. Tell me a little bit about the options for people to secure post-high school education upon release.
Well, I'm seeing more opportunities opening up for individuals post-release. At one time, there was, you check a box and you could get student loans. I'm happy to hear that the Pell Grants, there's a pilot going on within the federal system with Pell Grants. I am so happy to hear that, because it's a fact that individuals prior to 1994, I know many individuals who served time prior to that who came out with associate's degrees and went on to achieve bachelor's and master's. The fact is 98% of those who get a higher, a bachelor's or a higher degree never return to prison. I mean, that's something that we can't ignore. And I think that we should support as far as higher education within the system.
Thanks, Senator Baldwin.